Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to give you my top 10 tips for the IELTS speaking test, and these tips are ones that I've gathered and refined when I was working as an IELTS examiner. So these 10 tips are to help you avoid those common mistakes that I saw when I was working as an IELTS examiner, so this should be really useful for you. My first tip is to make sure that you prepare really well for part 3 of the test. I found that most students were really well prepared for part 2 of the test. That's the long term. They were terribly underprepared for part 3. And if you're going to get a good band score for IELTS speaking, you also need to make sure you're ready for part 3. That's the two-way discussion. That's where the examiner asks you a question about a topic that's more general than you would have had in part 1, and you have to answer, and then the examiner will ask you a follow-up question based on your answer. So make sure you spend time preparing for part 3 of the speaking test. Here's my second tip. I often found that as an examiner, I would ask a question and the candidate would respond almost immediately. They would be waiting for me to finish my question. And as soon as I finished speaking, they would straight away start to answer the question, almost as if they hadn't really thought much about my question. So it's really important you spend a few seconds just thinking about the question that the examiner has asked. You don't need to go straight into your answer. Think about your answer and then say it. And also, if you don't understand the question, or if you didn't hear the question properly, then it is perfectly okay to ask the examiner to either repeat the question or to clarify something. Now, in part 1 of the IELTS speaking test, all the examiner can do is to repeat the question. But in part 3, they can clarify, they can explain something. So if there's a word you didn't understand, you can say to the examiner, what do you mean by something, something? And that's okay, that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, it's even very good, because if you can ask the examiner for clarification, then you're using extra language, which increases your range of language. It's showing the examiner you can use language for clarification. It's better to clarify, to understand the question, than it is to guess. If you didn't understand a word, don't guess it. Don't try to guess what the examiner said. Just ask them to clarify, and they will be happy to do that. So here is my third tip, and we're going to go back to part 3 of the IELTS speaking test, the two-way discussion. You need to avoid speaking about your personal experiences in part 3. Part 3 is about having a general, slightly more abstract discussion about a topic. So don't say things like, I think working from home is a good idea because I can spend more time with my family. That's a personal experience, and part 3 is about more general discussions. So instead of that, you could say something like, working from home can be beneficial because many people find it helps them spend more time with their families. So you're making it much more general. It's not about you anymore. It's more about people in general. If you do speak about your personal experiences, then the examiner will probably interrupt you and say something like, can you speak more generally about this topic? Or they might say, oh, what about society in general? They will try and pull you away from personal experiences. My fourth tip is about discourse markers. Discourse markers are short words or phrases that help you tell the person you're speaking to what's going to come up next. For example, the discourse marker, for example, tells your listener that you're about to give an example of what you mean. So discourse markers are really important to use. However, it's also very important to use those discourse markers in a natural way. What I found as an examiner is there are certain discourse markers that candidates would use over and over and over again, and often in an inappropriate way. One of the most common examples of this was the discourse marker, to be honest. To be honest. So the examiner might ask, where do you live in part 1? If you say, to be honest, I live in Bangkok, or honestly, I live in London, then it's going to sound very strange. It won't sound natural. You just need to say, I live in Bangkok or I live in London. You don't need to have a discourse marker there. Only use phrases like, to be honest, when you're giving a real opinion. So the examiner might ask you, do you like commuting to work? Your answer might be, well, to be honest, I hate it because it takes so much time out of my day. So that is a more natural, more appropriate way of using a discourse marker, like, to be honest. So really my tip in tip 4 is be careful when you're using these discourse markers like, to be honest, honestly, personally. Try not to overuse them because it sounds unnatural if you do. My next tip is related to idioms. Idioms, I know, are really tricky. In fact, I've made another video of the 100 most useful idioms for IELTS writing and IELTS speaking. So make sure you check out that video as well. What I found as an examiner was candidates would often use quite unusual idioms and they would throw them into their spoken English. Particularly when they were trying to talk about emotions. They would use idioms like over the moon or feeling blue. I woke up on Sunday morning, it was raining and I was feeling blue. But native speakers don't really use idioms like those. So those kinds of uncommon idioms, which often relate to emotions and feelings, you need to be careful of using because it can make it sound as if you're using English in an unnatural way. But number 6, relevance. It is really important if you want band 7 or higher in IELTS speaking to make sure your answers are relevant. The word relevance or relevant appears many times in the band descriptors for the IELTS Examiner. So make sure when you're giving your answer, make sure it's relevant to the question. This goes back to my second tip, to make sure you listen carefully to the question, because if you don't listen carefully to the question and you just start speaking, then it's quite possible your answer will not be relevant to the question that was asked. Again, that's why you should ask the examiner for clarification or to repeat the question if you need to hear it again. So for example, if you're asked a question about living in a city, don't start talking about living in the countryside because that will not be relevant. And as soon as you start talking in an irrelevant way, your band score is likely to be limited to band 6. Number 7, use circumlocution. Circumlocution. What is circumlocution? you will be asking me, I hope. Circumlocution is when you don't know a word, but even though you don't know it, you can still talk about it using different words. It's a way of trying to work around your gap in your vocabulary. For example, I remember very vividly a candidate in one of my tests, and he couldn't remember the word wedding. So what he did was he said, the ceremony where two people join together as a family. And he admitted he couldn't remember the word, but by what he said, I understood what he was trying to talk about because he was using circumlocution. Circumlocution is a really useful skill to be able to use when you're learning a language, because you simply will not know all of the words in the English language. But it shows the ability to communicate your idea using a range of different words, and it's a really useful skill, and if you can do it, then that will impress the examiner. The thing to take away is that if you don't know a particular word, there's no need to panic. Just use circumlocution instead, and you will actually get some credit from the examiner. Number 8, it's really important when you practice IELTS speaking that you practice talking about a big variety of topics like travel, family, education, the environment, jobs, health, and so on. Because you never know what kind of topics are going to come up in the IELTS speaking test, especially in parts 2 and parts 3. So if you've practiced talking about a variety of topics, then when it comes to the exam, you will probably feel a little bit more confident about speaking about those topics. Tip number 9, when you're in the test room in the middle of the IELTS speaking test, you will usually see the examiner writing something down on a piece of paper. And I know that many candidates panic when they see that happening because they're worried that the examiner is writing down some notes about their performance in the test. They might even think they're writing down a score on the piece of paper. So I remember seeing candidates trying to peer at my piece of paper to see what I was writing down. And of course, that distracts them from what they should be doing in the test. I'll let you in on a secret. What examiners are actually doing is simply writing down the timings, because it's really important that examiners stick to a very precise timing of the exam. They've got to spend a certain number of minutes on part 1, a certain number of minutes on part 2 and part 3 as well. And they're not allowed to overrun, and they're not allowed to have the test shorter than it should be. So they're simply writing down times on that piece of paper. So the tip is basically, if you see the examiner writing anything down, ignore it. It has nothing to do with you. It's just about the clock. Number 10, my final tip, and I think this applies to this video, is knowing when to stop. In part 3 of the IELTS speaking test, if you feel you've said everything you can about a particular answer, don't keep on talking. I think a lot of candidates are really worried about silence, and they think they've got to keep on talking to impress the examiner. But actually, if you keep on talking, then you're probably going to just repeat yourself, or you're going to start talking in a very unclear way. So instead of keeping talking, it's a good idea to say something to the examiner that tells them that you've got nothing more to say. So, for example, you could say, I think that covers everything I can say about that topic. Or, the more honest, I can't think of anything else to say about that. And that is a good way of telling the examiner that you've got nothing more to say. Don't just say finished. Use proper language, because again, the examiner is going to be impressed with language that indicates that you've finished speaking. So on that note, it's time for me to stop talking. I hope you found that really useful. I hope those 10 tips will help you in your IELTS speaking preparation. And if you need some extra help, don't forget, look in the description and there are some links to give you that extra help. So good luck with IELTS and thank you very much for watching.